The smirk on my sister's face as the lawyer read those words will be forever burned into my memory. "You get nothing from Grandpa's will," she whispered, leaning close enough that her designer perfume made my nose itch. I sat there, frozen in humiliation as the rest of my family exchanged uncomfortable glances. 3 years of visiting Grandpa Henry every week, reading to him when his eyesight failed, listening to his stories while everyone else was too busy, and this was how he thanked me? But then the executor reached into his briefcase and pulled out a second document. "However," he said, adjusting his glasses, "there is something else Mr. Matthews wanted me to share after the will reading concluded." And just like that, everything changed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Emma Matthews, and until 6 months ago, I was just a barista at a local cafe, saving every tip I could toward culinary school. I lived in a tiny one-bedroom apartment, drove a secondhand Honda that made concerning noises on cold mornings, and spent my free time either visiting my grandfather or experimenting with new recipes in my cramped kitchen. I wasn't unhappy. Exactly. I had dreams, opening my own café-bakery someday, creating a place where people could gather and connect over good food. But those dreams seemed distant, something I'd achieve by my 40s if I was lucky and extremely careful with. Money. My sister Rebecca, on the other hand, had always been the successful one. Private university, MBA from Wharton, sleek condo in the financial district, designer everything. Rebecca had done everything right, according to our family's unspoken standards. She'd followed in the footsteps of our grandfather, Henry Matthews, who had built a small real estate investment into a multi-million-dollar portfolio of commercial properties and business holdings. Or at least, that's what she thought she'd done. The truth was, Rebecca barely knew our grandfather. Oh, she showed up at holiday gatherings and the occasional family dinner, making sure to mention her latest promotion or bonus within the first 5 minutes. But when Grandpa Henry's eyesight began failing 3 years ago, when he could no longer read the financial journals he loved or drive himself to his weekly chess game at the park, Rebecca was suddenly too busy to visit. I wasn't. Every Thursday, evening and Sunday afternoon, I'd bring fresh muffins, his favorite was blueberry with a lemon glaze, and spend hours reading to him. Everything from mystery novels to the financial papers he still followed religiously. Sometimes we'd just talk. He'd tell me stories about building his business from nothing, about the risks he took that paid off and the mistakes that taught him valuable lessons. The secret to success isn't being the smartest person in the room, Emma, he'd say, his weathered hands gesturing for emphasis. It's being the most persistent, the one willing to start small and build patiently. I soaked up these moments, treasuring the wisdom he shared, never once thinking about what material value our relationship might have, which is why the reading of the will hit me like a physical blow. It was held at Morrison & Associates, the law firm Grandpa had used for decades. The office screamed old money, dark wood paneling, leather chairs that creaked satisfyingly. When you sat in them, oil paintings of landscapes I assumed were supposed to be significant. I felt distinctly out of place in my department store blazer and the only pair of dress pants I owned, especially when Rebecca arrived in an outfit that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent. "Emma," she acknowledged with a thin smile. "I'm surprised they let you take time off from serving coffee." "It's a cafe," I corrected automatically. And Grandpa Henry was important to me. She simply raised an eyebrow and checked her reflection in a compact mirror. Our parents arrived next, followed by Uncle Steve and Aunt Linda, then our cousin Nathan, who worked at some tech startup and never stopped talking about cryptocurrency. Everyone was dressed immaculately, wearing expressions of practiced grief that didn't quite reach their eyes. Mr. Morrison, a silver-haired gentleman with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, called the meeting to order. He cleared his throat. and began reading the last will and testament of Henry James Matthews. The beach house in Maine went to our parents. The stock portfolio, valued at just over $1 million, went to Uncle Steve and Aunt Linda. Cousin Nathan received Grandpa's collection of classic cars, including a vintage Corvette he'd been eyeing for years. Various financial assets were distributed among the family members. To my granddaughter Rebecca, Mr. Morrison read, "I leave my collection of first edition books and the sum of $50,000. Rebecca smiled, satisfied but not impressed. The book collection alone was worth over $100,000. Finally, Mr. Morrison adjusted his glasses and continued, "To my granddaughter Emma, I leave my best wishes for continued success in her endeavors." The room fell silent. I felt my face grow hot as everyone's eyes turned to me. Best wishes? That was it? Rebecca leaned over, her voice a stage whisper designed to be heard by everyone. "You get nothing from Grandpa's will," she smirked. "Guess all those visits didn't pay off after all." I stared at my hands, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. It wasn't about the money. I'd never expected a windfall, but the apparent dismissal of our relationship cut deep. Had I misunderstood what those afternoons meant to him? Had he seen me as just an obligation, a dutiful granddaughter checking a box? That concludes the reading of Henry Matthews' last will and testament, Mr. Morrison announced. The family began to stir, gathering their things, already discussing their inheritances. Rebecca was on the phone immediately, telling someone about the books she'd received. However, Mr. Morrison's voice cut through the murmurs. "There is a second document that Mr. Matthews instructed me to read only after the will was concluded." The room quieted again as Mr. Morrison reached into his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope. "This is a personal letter from Henry Matthews, with specific instructions that it be read in the presence of all family members gathered here today." I sat up straighter, my heart pounding against my ribs. Mr. Morrison opened the envelope carefully, unfolded the pages inside, and began to read. "My dear family, if you're hearing this, then my will has been read and assets distributed as legally required. But a man's true wealth isn't measured in possessions, and a person's worth isn't determined by what they inherit. For the past 5 years, I've been conducting an experiment of sorts, watching, listening, and learning about each of you. Who you've become when no one is looking. What you prioritize when you think no one is keeping score. I've lived a long life and accumulated more than I need. Material wealth is easy to distribute, but wisdom is harder to pass on unless someone is willing to listen." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her seat. My parents exchanged glances. Uncle Steve cleared his throat. "To my family members who received tangible inheritances today, consider what you've been given as both blessing and test. What will you do with it? How will it shape who you become? And to my dearest Emma, who received no material inheritance, through my will, your gift is different, delivered not through legal documents but through the time we've shared. You alone chose to be present, not for what you could get, but for what you could give. That choice has made all the difference." I felt tears prickling behind my eyes as Grandpa's words washed over me. Even from beyond the grave, he understood what had mattered between us. Mr. Morrison paused, then turned the page. "There's more," he said, and continued. "Which brings me to the second document." From his briefcase, he pulled out a thick leather portfolio and placed it on the table. "This contains the details of a separate trust that Henry Matthews established 3 years ago." Rebecca leaned forward. "What separate trust? Why wasn't this mentioned in the will?" "Because," Mr. Morrison explained patiently, "it exists outside the will as a distinct legal entity, the Matthews Legacy Trust." He opened the portfolio. Henry Matthews transferred the majority of his business holdings, valued at approximately $4 million, into this trust. A stunned silence fell over the room. I could almost hear the mental calculations happening in everyone's heads. The sole trustee and beneficiary, Mr. Morrison continued, is Emma Matthews. What? Rebecca's voice sliced through the silence. That's impossible. There must be some mistake. There's no mistake, Mr. Morrison replied calmly. Everything is properly documented and legally binding. Rebecca turned to me, her face flushed with anger. What did you do? How did you manipulate him? I sat frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. $4 million? Business holdings? Me? I didn't do anything, I finally managed. That's ridiculous. Rebecca stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. She's a barista. She doesn't know the first thing about running businesses. Perhaps, Mr. Morrison interjected, you should continue listening before jumping to conclusions. He turned to the next page of Grandpa's letter. To Emma. I've watched you work tirelessly at that cafe, saving every penny, treating customers with kindness even when they don't deserve it. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I've seen how you manage your limited resources with care and integrity. The Matthews Legacy Trust includes my commercial real estate holdings, my ownership stakes in 3 businesses, and investment accounts established for their maintenance. They generate substantial annual income. However, this inheritance comes with conditions. First, you must either hire qualified management or learn to manage these assets yourself. Education costs will be covered by the trust. Second, for 5 years, you must maintain your current modest lifestyle. No extravagant purchases, no quitting your job at the cafe. The trust will pay for your culinary school, but otherwise, you'll live as you have been. Third, each year, you must allocate a portion of the trust's income to worthy causes of your choosing. These conditions aren't punishment, they're protection. Wealth changes people, rarely for the better. I want you to understand its purpose before you enjoy its privileges. I felt a strange calm settle over me as Grandpa's intentions became clear. This wasn't just about money. It was about values, about learning to handle responsibility before privilege, about understanding that wealth was a tool, not an identity. Rebecca, however, was far from calm. This is absurd, she exploded. She's going to run everything into the ground. My mother finally spoke up. Rebecca, that's enough. But Rebecca wasn't finished. I have an MBA from Wharton. I'm a financial analyst. It should be me managing those assets, not her. Mr. Morrison looked at her over his glasses. Mr. Matthews made his decisions after careful consideration. They are final. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur. Mr. Morrison explained that he would work with me in the coming weeks to understand my responsibilities as trustee. The family dispersed in various states of shock, congratulation, or in Rebecca's case, barely contained fury. As I gathered my things to leave, still numb with disbelief, Rebecca cornered me by the elevator. "This isn't over," she hissed. "I'm contesting the trust." Grandpa clearly wasn't in his right mind. "He seemed perfectly lucid during all our visits," I replied, struggling to keep my voice steady. "Oh, please," she rolled her eyes. "Reading him books and bringing him muffins? That's the oldest trick in the book. I just never thought you were calculating enough to pull it off." The accusation stung precisely because it was so far from the truth. I had never once thought about Grandpa's money during our time together. "Think what you want, Rebecca," I said quietly. But Grandpa made his decision for a reason. "We'll see about that," she snapped as the elevator doors opened. "Don't get too comfortable in your new role. It won't last." I stepped into the elevator, my mind reeling. As the doors closed on Rebecca's angry face, I knew this was just the beginning. The inheritance wasn't just assets and responsibility. It was also the beginning of a family storm I wasn't sure I was equipped to weather. That night, I sat on the small balcony of my apartment, watching the city lights blink on as dusk settled. The same apartment I would continue to live in for the next 5 years, according to Grandpa's conditions. I tried to make sense of the day's events. Part of me felt overwhelmed by the responsibility Grandpa had placed on my shoulders. I knew nothing about managing commercial real estate or business investments. Another part felt hurt that Rebecca could so easily believe I'd manipulated our grandfather for financial gain. But beneath it all was a growing sense of determination. Grandpa Henry had seen something in me, some capacity for learning, for growth, for responsible stewardship, and I was determined not to let him down. If he believed I could handle this challenge, then perhaps I could. I picked up my phone and scrolled to the last photo I had of us together. Grandpa sitting in his favorite armchair, me perched on the ottoman beside him, both of us laughing at something now forgotten. His eyes were bright with intelligence and humor, even as his body had begun to fail him. "What were you thinking, Grandpa?" I whispered to the photo. "What am I supposed to do with all of this?" Almost as if in answer, I remembered something he'd told me during one of our last visits. We'd been discussing a chapter in his favorite business book about facing challenges beyond your current capabilities. "The secret, Emma," he'd said, tapping the page with a gnarled finger, "is to never pretend you know more than you do. Admit what you don't know. Find people who do know. Learn everything you can, and then make the best decision with the information available. That's all anyone can do." I took a deep breath and straightened my shoulders. Tomorrow, I would call Mr. Morrison and begin learning about what exactly I'd inherited. I would find advisors I could trust. I would start the process of understanding Grandpa's business world. And somehow, I would find a way to honor both the letter and the spirit of his unusual gift. Not just the financial assets, but the deeper inheritance, his belief in persistence, in starting small and building patiently, in creating something meaningful that would outlast a single lifetime. As for Rebecca, that was a problem for another day. But I couldn't help wondering if perhaps Grandpa's gift wasn't just for me. Maybe, just maybe, there was a lesson in it for my sister as, well, one that couldn't be taught in business school or measured in dollars and cents. A lesson about what truly matters when all the accounts are finally settled. The weeks following the will reading were some of the most difficult of my life. I'd always prided myself on handling pressure well. You don't survive the morning rush at a busy cafe without developing nerves of steel. But this was different. This wasn't managing impatient customers or juggling multiple orders. This was $4 million worth of responsibility I hadn't asked for and wasn't sure I could handle. My first meeting with Mr. Morrison lasted 3 hours. He walked me through the structure of the trust, explaining terms I'd never encountered before: appreciating assets, capital gains considerations, property tax abatements, depreciation schedules. By the end, my head was swimming, and I'd filled an entire notebook with questions I was too overwhelmed to ask. "Don't worry," Mr. Morrison said kindly, noticing my expression. "Henry didn't expect you to understand everything immediately. That's why he structured the trust with a 3-person advisory board for the first 5 years." "Who's on this board?" I asked, hoping for allies who could help me navigate these unfamiliar waters. "Myself, Henry's longtime accountant Gerald Phillips, and his property manager Diane Winters," Mr. Morrison explained. "We're here to advise, not control. All final decisions rest with you as trustee." That was both comforting and terrifying. I wouldn't be completely alone, but the responsibility still ultimately fell to me. As if managing the inheritance wasn't stressful enough, Rebecca launched her campaign to overturn the trust almost immediately. Her lawyer, a sharp-featured woman with predatory eyes, sent formal letters challenging my grandfather's mental competence when he established the trust. My phone filled with messages from family members, some supportive, others clearly taking Rebecca's side. From Mom: "Can't you girls work something out? Your grandfather wouldn't want the family torn apart over money." From Uncle Steve. Rebecca's very hurt, Emma. Maybe consider bringing her in as co-trustee. She does have the business background for it. From Cousin Nathan. This is wild. But honestly, Becca's scary when she's angry. Maybe throw her a bone. The pressure was relentless, and most nights I lay awake wondering if I should just walk away from all of it. Give Rebecca what she wanted. Let someone else deal with the responsibility. But every time I considered giving up, I remembered the faith Grandpa Henry had placed in me. He could have chosen anyone to manage his legacy. He chose me. There had to be a reason. My routine became a strange blend of ordinary and extraordinary. Mornings at the cafe, pouring coffee and making change. Afternoons in Mr. Morrison's office or meeting with property managers, trying to understand the empire my grandfather had built. Evenings hunched over business textbooks and online courses, attempting to learn in months what others studied for years. The cafe became my sanctuary, the one place where I knew exactly what I was doing, where success was measured in satisfied customers rather than investment returns. My manager, Tanya, noticed the change in me. "You seem stressed," she commented one morning as we prepared to open. "Everything okay?" I hesitated. I hadn't told anyone at work about the inheritance, partly because it felt unreal, partly because I didn't want to be treated differently. "Family stuff," I said vaguely. "It's complicated." She nodded, not pressing further. "Well, if you need to adjust your hours or anything, let me know. You're my best employee. I don't want to lose you." Her simple vote of confidence meant more than she knew. 3 weeks after the will reading, Rebecca showed up at my apartment unannounced. When I opened the door, she pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, her designer heels clicking sharply against my worn hardwood floors. "We need to talk," she announced, surveying my small living space with poorly disguised disdain. "Come in," I muttered, closing the door behind her. She perched on the edge of my sofa, declining my offer of tea. "I'll get straight to the point. My lawyer says challenging the trust will be expensive and time-consuming. It could drag on for years." "I didn't ask for this, Rebecca," I said tiredly. "Grandpa made his choice." "A choice based on what? Your weekly visits with muffins? Playing the devoted granddaughter?" Her voice was razor-sharp. While I was actually following in his footsteps, building a career in finance, making something of myself. The accusation stung. "Is that what you think happened? That I manipulated him?" "What else am I supposed to think?" she demanded. "You have no business experience, no education in finance or real estate. You're a barista, Emma." "I know that," I said quietly. "Better than anyone." Something in my tone must have reached her because she paused, studying me more carefully. "Then why did he choose you?" It was the question I'd been asking myself for weeks. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I think it had something to do with how we spent our time together. He told me stories about building his business from nothing, about the mistakes he made and what he learned from them." Rebecca's expression flickered. "He tried to tell me those stories too. I always changed the subject. I thought I knew better, newer. Strategies, modern theories from business school." The admission surprised me. It was the first crack in her armor I'd ever seen. "Look," I said, seizing the moment of vulnerability. "I'm drowning here. I'm taking classes, meeting with advisors, trying to understand what I've inherited. But there's so much I don't know." "Exactly my point," she said, but without the earlier venom. "But I'm trying," I continued, "because Grandpa believed I could do this, and I won't disrespect his memory by giving up without trying." Rebecca stood abruptly, smoothing her skirt. "Well, don't expect me to bail you out when you run his legacy into the ground." "I don't expect anything from you," I replied. "But the door is open if you ever want to talk about Grandpa." About the person he was, not just the assets he left behind. She paused at the door. "You're making a mistake, Emma. This isn't some cafe where charm and good intentions are enough. This is business." After she left, I sank onto the sofa, emotionally drained. The worst part was that she wasn't entirely wrong. This wasn't just about honoring Grandpa's wishes. It was about preserving what he'd spent a lifetime building, and I was terrified of failing. The following morning, I received a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at Riverside Plaza building. See 3rd floor, suite 307, 2 p.m., important. DW, Diane Winters, the property manager on my advisory board." I'd spoken with her briefly by phone, but hadn't met her in person yet. Riverside Plaza was one of the commercial properties in the trust, a mixed-use development with retail on the ground floor and offices above. I arrived promptly at 2 p.m., navigating the polished hallways until I found Suite 307, a small office with Matthews Properties on the door. Inside, a woman in her 60s with silver-streaked dark hair and practical clothes looked up from a desk covered in papers. "Emma," she said, standing to greet me. "Thank you for coming. I'm Diane." "Is everything okay?" I asked, noticing the stacks of folders everywhere. "That depends on your definition of okay," she replied, gesturing for me to sit. "I wanted you to see this office, your office technically, and get a feel for how your grandfather actually ran his business." I looked around, taking in the modest furnishings, the well-worn desk chair, the filing cabinets that had seen better days. Nothing like the sleek, modern offices I'd imagined. "It's smaller than I expected," I admitted. Diane laughed. "Henry wasn't one for showing off. He put his money into the properties, not into impressing people with fancy offices." She pulled a folder from one stack and opened it. "This is what I really wanted to show you. The Parkview Apartments renovation project." Inside were blueprints, contractor bids, and a detailed budget. "Your grandfather was planning to convert this older building into affordable housing for seniors. He'd secured partial funding through a city program, but was covering the rest himself. Construction was supposed to start next month." I studied the materials, noting the care that had gone into the planning. "Why are you showing me this now?" "Because the advisory board will be meeting next week to review all ongoing projects," Diane explained. "Gerald, the accountant, will likely recommend postponing this one. It's not the most profitable use of the capital." "But it was important to Grandpa," I said, understanding dawning. Diane nodded. "Henry balanced profit with purpose. He believed that business success meant nothing if it didn't create value for others." She met my eyes directly. "The board advises. You decide. I thought you should know what you're deciding about." That visit changed everything for me. Until then, I'd been thinking of the trust as a burden, a complex financial entity I had to manage without breaking. But standing in Grandpa's modest office, looking at his plans to help seniors afford housing, I began to see it differently. This wasn't just about assets and returns. It was about values and vision. I spent the next few days poring over the Parkview Apartments plans, educating myself about affordable housing initiatives, the tax incentives involved, and the community impact. When the advisory board meeting came, Gerald Phillips did indeed recommend postponing the project. "The return on investment is minimal," he explained, pointing to his financial projections. "We could allocate those funds to more profitable ventures." Mr. Morrison remained neutral, explaining both the financial considerations and the community benefits. When they turned to me for a decision, I took a deep breath. "We're moving forward with the Parkview project as my grandfather intended," I said firmly. "This isn't just about financial returns. It's about the kind of legacy we're building." Gerald looked disappointed but not surprised. Diane smiled slightly. Mr. Morrison nodded with what looked like approval. It was my first real decision as trustee, and it felt right. I was honoring not just what my grandfather owned, but what he valued. Outside the meeting room, Diane caught up with me. "That was a good call in there," she said. "Financially sound enough to make sense, socially valuable enough to matter." "Thank you for showing me the office," I replied, "for helping me understand what this is really about." "Your grandfather talked about you a lot," she said, surprising me. "He said you reminded him of himself at your age, working hard, dreaming big, treating people right." "He said that?" I asked, a lump forming in my throat. "Many times." She squeezed my arm. "He chose you for a reason, Emma. Remember that when things get tough." And things definitely got tough. Rebecca's legal challenge to the trust proceeded, requiring depositions and document reviews. The family continued to pressure me to make peace by giving Rebecca a role, and I was still trying to manage my regular job while learning about commercial, real estate, and business management. It was during this chaotic period that I received a surprising message from Rebecca. "Need to talk. Neutral territory. Coffee at Martin's tomorrow? 10 a.m. Martin's was an upscale cafe downtown. Definitely her turf, not mine. But I was curious enough to agree. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee. I slid into the seat across from her, noting the dark circles under her eyes partially concealed by expensive makeup. "Thanks for coming," she said, pushing one of the coffees toward me. "What's this about?" I asked, skipping the pleasantries. She twisted her watch around her wrist, a nervous habit I recognized from childhood. "I've been doing some research about Grandpa's businesses." "Okay. Did you know about the Parkview Apartments project?" she asked. I nodded, surprised. "We just approved moving forward with it." Something like respect flickered in her eyes. That was a passion project for him. Not great ROI, but high social impact. "How do you know about it?" I asked. "I've been talking to some of his business associates," she admitted, trying to understand why. She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Why he chose you and not me. "And?" I prompted. "And I'm starting to think there was more to his business philosophy than I realized," she said slowly. "Everyone keeps talking about his integrity, his commitment to the community, how he valued relationships over transactions." She looked down at her coffee. "All the soft skills I dismissed as irrelevant." It was the most vulnerable I'd seen her since we were children. For a moment, I glimpsed the sister I'd been close to before competition and comparison drove us apart. "Rebecca," I said carefully, "I'm in over my head with all of this. I'm taking classes, meeting with advisors, reading everything I can, but there's so much I don't know." "So why not just give it up?" she challenged, but without the usual edge. "Let me handle it, or sell everything and take the cash." "Because that's not what Grandpa wanted," I replied. "He believed I could do this, learn what I need to learn. And the conditions he set, keeping my job, maintaining my lifestyle, I think he was trying to protect me from changing too quickly, from losing sight of what matters." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. "The legal challenge isn't going well," she finally said. "Morrison's firm has everything buttoned up tight." "Then why continue?" I asked. She looked at me directly. "Because I'm afraid you'll ruin everything he built. Because I'm angry he didn't trust me with it. Because it feels like no matter how hard I worked, how much I achieved, it wasn't enough." The raw honesty caught me off guard. "Rebecca, it wasn't a competition." "Wasn't it?" she asked bitterly. "In this family, it's always been about achievement, success, living up to the Matthews name." I understood then what was really driving her. Not greed or entitlement, but a desperate need for validation, for proof that she was worthy of the legacy our grandfather had built. "What if," I said slowly, forming the idea as I spoke, "what if we stopped fighting about this and starting learning from each other instead?" Her eyes narrowed suspiciously. What do you mean? You have the business education and experience. I lack. I have. Well, I have a perspective on Grandpa's values that you missed by not spending time with him these last few years. So what are you suggesting? That I help you? That we help each other, I clarified. No legal documents, no formal arrangement yet. Just conversation, questions, exchange of ideas. She considered this, tapping one manicured nail against her coffee cup. And what would I get out of this arrangement? Insight into what Grandpa really valued in business, the stories he told me, the wisdom he shared, and maybe, if things go well, we could discuss a more formal role for you down the road. You're not just saying this to get me to drop the legal challenge? She asked skeptically. The challenge isn't going anywhere, I reminded her. But this way, we both get something valuable while the lawyers do their thing. She didn't agree immediately, but she didn't dismiss the idea either. I'll think about it, she said, finishing her coffee. In the meantime, there's a refinancing proposal coming up for the Riverside property. Have your advisors looked at it yet? It's on the agenda for next week, I said. She pulled a small notebook from her bag, scribbled something, and tore out the page. Look for these clauses specifically. The interest reset terms can be tricky. I took the paper, surprised by this unexpected help. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, she replied, standing to leave. I still think I should be running this trust. But I don't want to see Grandpa's legacy damaged while we figure that out. It wasn't exactly a truce, but it was something. A tiny crack in the wall between us. After she left, I stayed at the cafe, thinking about our conversation. Rebecca's perspective had always been so different from mine. She saw business as a conquest, a series of strategic victories. I saw it more as a relationship, a way to create value and connection. But maybe we were both partly right. Maybe the best approach combined her business acumen with my people-centered values. Maybe that's what Grandpa had been trying to tell us all along. The refinancing meeting the following week proved Rebecca's advice invaluable. The clauses she'd warned me about would have cost the trust hundreds of thousands in the long run. When I questioned those terms specifically, Gerald looked impressed, and Mr. Morrison smiled knowingly. Your grandfather would be proud, he said after the meeting. You're asking the right questions. I had some help, I admitted. From Rebecca? He asked, surprising me with his insight. I nodded. Interesting, was all he said. Over the next few weeks, Rebecca and I established an uneasy collaboration. She would text me questions to ask before meetings. I would share stories Grandpa had told me about specific properties or business decisions. We weren't exactly friendly, but we were communicating more honestly than we had in years. The real breakthrough came 2 months after the will reading. I was meeting with a contractor for the Parkview Apartments project when Rebecca unexpectedly showed up at the construction site. What are you doing here? I asked, genuinely confused. I wanted to see it for myself, she said, looking around at what would eventually become affordable housing for seniors. Understand why it mattered to him. The contractor, sensing tension, excused himself to check on something with his crew. And? I prompted once we were alone. It's not what I would have done with the capital, she admitted, but I can see why it mattered to him, how it fits with his overall approach. She pulled out her tablet and showed me a spreadsheet. I've been analyzing his investment patterns over the last decade. There's a clear balancing of profit-driven ventures with community impact projects. He was systematic about it. For every 2 high-yield investments, he would take on one project with more modest returns but greater social value. I peered at the data, impressed by her analysis. You figured this out by yourself? I do have an MBA, she reminded me, but without the usual smugness. This is what I'm good at, seeing patterns, understanding systems. It's remarkable, I said sincerely. This helps me understand his overall strategy so much better. Something shifted in her expression, a softening, a glimpse of the sister I remembered from childhood. "He was smarter than I gave him credit for," she said quietly. "I thought his old-school approach was outdated, but he wasn't just investing for financial return. He was investing for legacy, for impact." "That's what he talked about most in our conversations," I offered. "Not how much money he made, but what difference he made. The families who could afford homes because of his developments, the businesses that thrived in his commercial spaces." Rebecca nodded slowly. "I think I misunderstood what success meant to him. I was so focused on the numbers. And I didn't appreciate the business acumen behind his decisions," I admitted. "The strategic thinking that made his generosity possible." We stood there amid construction materials and blueprints, two sisters who had spent years growing apart, suddenly finding unexpected common ground in our grandfather's legacy. "The legal challenge?" Rebecca said abruptly. "I'm dropping it." "You are?" I couldn't hide my surprise. "It's a waste of resources," she said practically. "Resources that could be better used elsewhere." I studied her face, looking for the real reason behind this sudden change of heart. "And?" She sighed, looking out over the construction site. "And I think I'm starting to understand why he structured things this way. Why he chose you." She met my eyes directly. "You have something I don't, Emma. A natural instinct for what he valued most." It was the closest thing to a compliment she'd offered me in years. "And you have something I don't," I replied. "The education and experience to execute on those values effectively." A thought that had been forming over our weeks of cautious collaboration suddenly crystallized. "Rebecca, what if we stopped seeing this as your way versus my way? What if we combined our strengths instead?" "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked, but I could tell she was interested. "Not co-trustees, not yet, but something more formal than our current arrangement. A defined role that uses your financial expertise while respecting the structure Grandpa created." She considered this, her analytical mind visibly working through the possibilities. "I'd need to see a detailed proposal, specific responsibilities, compensation, decision-making authority." "Of course," I agreed. "We could work on it together, with input from the advisory board. Make sure it honors both Grandpa's intentions and your capabilities." "And you'd be willing to share control?" she asked skeptically. "After everything that's happened?" I thought about it honestly. "Not control," I said finally, "but influence, expertise, partnership, yes. Because I think that's what Grandpa would have wanted once we both learned the lessons he was trying to teach us." Rebecca didn't immediately agree, but she didn't dismiss the idea either. "Let's see how the Parkview project develops," she said. "If we can work together effectively on that, maybe there's a path forward." It wasn't a resolution, but it was a beginning. A chance to transform competition into collaboration. To build something neither of us could create alone. As we walked back to our cars, Rebecca paused. "Do you remember when we were kids and we used to play store in Grandpa's office?" I smiled at the memory. "You were always the boss, and I was always the customer." "You were a terrible customer," she recalled, a reluctant smile tugging at her lips. "Always changing your order, asking too many questions." "And you were a terrible boss," I countered. "Too focused on the money, not enough on making the pretend customers happy." "Maybe we haven't changed as much as we thought," she mused. "Or maybe we've been changing in the right direction all along," I suggested, learning what we each needed to learn. As I drove home that evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the will reading. Hope. Not just that I could handle the responsibility I'd been given, but that Rebecca and I might find our way back to being sisters again. Different but complementary. Separate but connected. Maybe that had been Grandpa's plan all along. Not to divide us, but to bring us together in a way that would make both of us better. Not to choose one way of thinking over another, but to create a legacy that combined the best of both. The path forward wasn't clear yet, and I knew there would be challenges ahead. But for the first time, I felt truly confident that I was honoring not just the letter of my grandfather's wishes, but their spirit as well. Building not just on what he had owned, but on who he had been. And that, I was beginning to understand, was the most valuable inheritance of all. One morning in early spring, about 4 months after the will reading, I woke before my alarm. The soft glow of dawn filtered through my curtains as I lay there thinking about the Parkview Apartments project. Construction had officially begun the previous week, and I'd felt a strange mix of pride and terror watching the excavators break ground. This was real. This was happening. Under my watch. I made coffee and took it to my small balcony, watching the city slowly come to life. The conversation with Rebecca at the construction site had changed something between us. The open hostility had transformed into a cautious professional relationship. She still hadn't formally dropped her legal challenge, but her lawyer seemed to be pursuing it with less vigor, as if going through the motions while waiting for further instructions. My phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "Meeting with Westfield Development today? Don't agree to anything on the spot." I smiled slightly. These morning warnings had become routine, Rebecca's way of offering guidance without officially admitting. We were working together. I typed back, "Thanks for the heads up. What should I be watching for?" 3 dots appeared, then, "They'll try to lowball the property value. The area's being rezoned next month. They know it, but they're hoping." You don't. This was the strange new reality of my life. Tips on multi-million-dollar negotiations while sitting in pajamas on my cramped balcony, preparing for a shift at the cafe. 2 worlds that never should have collided. Later that day, Mr. Morrison and I sat across from the Westfield executives in a sleek conference room. They offered exactly what Rebecca had predicted, a generous price for a small commercial lot that would be worth substantially more after the upcoming rezoning. "That's an interesting offer," I said, channeling the calm confidence I'd seen Rebecca deploy in our recent meetings. "But given the City Council's vote next month, I think we both know the property will be considerably more valuable soon." The lead negotiator's expression flickered with surprise. Beside me, Mr. Morrison's lips twitched in a suppressed smile. "We can certainly discuss a slight adjustment," the man began, but I cut him off politely. "Why don't you run the numbers again with the new zoning classification in mind? We're not in a hurry to sell." Outside, after they'd left with promises to reconsider their position, Mr. Morrison turned to me. "Your grandfather negotiated exactly the same way," he said, a note of approval in his voice. "Firm but fair. Knowledgeable but not arrogant." I felt a flush of pride, followed by a pang of guilt. "I had some help," I admitted. "Rebecca warned me they'd try to take advantage of the rezoning situation." Mr. Morrison nodded, unsurprised. "The 2 of you working together. Henry would have found that quite satisfying." "We're not exactly working together," I clarified. "Just communicating." "A significant improvement from where you started," he observed. "Sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't what's listed in legal documents." His words stayed with me through my afternoon shift at the cafe. Was this what Grandpa had intended all along? Not to create a rift between us, but to build a bridge? Not to choose me over Rebecca, but to help us find our way to a partnership neither of us would have considered otherwise. That evening, I decided to take a risk. I texted Rebecca. "Dinner tomorrow? My place. I want to talk about something important." The reply came almost immediately. "What is it?" "A proposal," I answered. Something I think Grandpa would have wanted. There was a long pause before her response. Fine. 7 p.m. The next day passed in a blur of nervous energy. After my cafe shift, I cleaned my apartment, prepared the simple pasta dish our grandmother had taught us both to make as children, and reviewed the notes I'd been making for weeks. Rebecca arrived precisely at 7, dressed more casually than usual in dark jeans and a silk blouse. She handed me a bottle of wine, a peace offering of sorts. "It smells like Nonna's pasta," she said, setting her purse down. "It is," I replied. I thought something familiar might help with a difficult conversation. Her eyebrow arched. "So this is a difficult conversation?" "It doesn't have to be," I said, pouring the wine. "But it's an important one." We ate at my small kitchen table, the initial awkwardness gradually easing as we shared memories of our grandmother teaching us to cook, of Grandpa Henry pretending the pasta was the best he'd ever tasted, even when we'd drastically oversalted it as children. After dinner, I cleared the plates and pulled out a folder. "I've been thinking about what you said at the Parkview site, about combining our strengths." Rebecca's expression turned guarded. And I think you were right," I said, opening the folder. "I've drawn up a proposal for a formal role for you within the trust. Not as co-trustee, not yet, anyway, but as Chief Investment Officer." She took the papers, scanning them with the rapid efficiency I'd come to respect. "This is substantial," she said finally. "Full strategic authority over investment decisions, competitive compensation, a seat on the advisory board. With the understanding that major decisions still require my approval as trustee," I added. "But yes, it's a real position with real authority." "Why?" she asked bluntly. "Why now? Why this?" I took a deep breath. "Because you were right about some things. I don't have the business background for this. I'm learning, but there's so much I don't know." "That's not the only reason," she said, studying my face. "No," I admitted. "It's also because I've seen how you approach things differently than I do. You see patterns and opportunities I miss. You understand systems and structures I'm just beginning to grasp." "And?" she prompted. "And because I think this is what Grandpa wanted all along," I said quietly. "For us to learn from each other, to build something together that's better than what either of us could create alone." Rebecca set the proposal down, her expression unreadable. "You realize this contradicts everything I've been saying about your ability to manage the trust." "I know," I acknowledged, "but we both know the legal challenge isn't going anywhere. This gives you a real role, real influence, and it gives me your expertise. We both win." "And if I say no?" she asked, testing me. "Then we continue as we have been. You offering occasional advice, me making the final decisions. Nothing changes except a missed opportunity." She was quiet for a long moment, fingertips tapping lightly on the proposal. "I need time to think about this," she said finally, "to review it properly." "Of course," I agreed. "Take all the time you need." As she gathered her things to leave, she paused. "The pasta was exactly like Nonna's," she said unexpectedly. "I'd forgotten how it tasted." It was such a small thing, but the genuine warmth in her voice felt like a breakthrough. "Maybe we could do this again," I suggested, "regardless of your decision about the proposal." She nodded, the smallest hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "I'd like that." After she left, I sat on my sofa, exhausted but hopeful. For the first time since the will reading, I felt like I might be on the right track. Not just with managing Grandpa's assets, but with understanding what he'd truly wanted to pass on to us. A week passed with no response from Rebecca. I tried, not to obsess over her silence, focusing instead on the growing pile of work associated with the trust. The Westfield developers had come back with a significantly improved offer. The Parkview construction had hit an unexpected snag with the foundation. 3 commercial tenants were up for lease renewal. Each decision required research, meetings, and careful consideration. I was getting better at asking the right questions, at understanding the implications of different choices, but the learning curve remained steep. On Friday afternoon, just as I was finishing my cafe shift, Rebecca walked in. She rarely came to my workplace, and seeing her there in her business attire among the casual coffee drinkers was jarring. "Do you have a minute?" she asked, uncharacteristically uncertain. I nodded to Tanya that I was taking a break and led Rebecca to a quiet corner table. "I've reviewed your proposal," she said without preamble. "It's fair. More than fair, actually." "But?" I prompted, hearing the hesitation in her voice. "But I don't want it," she said, meeting my eyes directly. My heart sank. "I see." "No, you don't," she continued. "I've drafted a counter-proposal." She placed a folder on the table between us. "Take your time with it. It's different from what you suggested." Curious, I opened the folder. Inside was a detailed document outlining not just a role for Rebecca, but a complete restructuring of how we would work together. Not as boss and employee, not even as trustee and advisor, but as genuine partners with complementary responsibilities. "You'd still be the sole trustee legally," she explained as I scanned the pages, "but operationally, we'd divide responsibilities according to our strengths. You'd handle tenant relations, community impact projects, public-facing decisions. I'd manage investments, financial planning, business strategy." "Like co-CEOs with different focus areas," I mused. "Exactly," she nodded. "Equal input, equal respect, different domains." I studied her face, looking for the catch. "Why this instead of what I offered?" Rebecca sighed, running a finger around the rim of her untouched coffee cup. "Because what you proposed was generous, but still hierarchical. You'd be my boss. We'd still have the same dynamic we've always had. You trying to prove yourself worthy of Grandpa's choice, me trying to prove my expertise matters more than your intuition." She was right, I realized. My proposal, well-intentioned as it was, had reinforced the very power dynamic that had driven us apart. "This," she continued, tapping the counter-proposal, "requires real trust, real partnership, real change from both of us." "It's a big step," I said cautiously. "It is," she agreed. "And if you're not ready, I understand. We can start with your original proposal and work toward this over time." The humility in her voice, so unlike the Rebecca I'd known for years, caught me off guard. This wasn't an ultimatum or a power play. It was a genuinely thoughtful alternative. "Let me think about it," I said finally. "Really consider what it would mean day to day." She nodded, standing to leave. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." As she reached the door, a thought struck me. "Rebecca," I called after her, "what about the legal challenge?" She turned back. "I've already instructed my lawyer to withdraw it," she said simply. "Whatever you decide about this proposal, that chapter is closed." The gesture left me speechless. It was the clearest indication yet that something fundamental had shifted between us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my small apartment, weighing Rebecca's counter-proposal against my original offer. Both had merits, both had risks, but hers required something I wasn't sure I was ready for: complete trust in the sister who had spent months trying to take everything from me. Around midnight, on a sudden impulse, I drove to Grandpa Henry's house. I still had the key, though I'd only been back once since his death to collect some personal items. The house was in limbo, part of the trust assets but not yet sold or repurposed. I let myself in, the familiar scent of his pipe tobacco and old books washing over me. The grandfather clock in the hall still ticked steadily, marking time as it had for decades. I made my way to his study, turning on the small desk lamp that cast a warm glow over the room. This was where we'd spent so many hours together. Where he'd told me stories of his business ventures and life lessons. Where he'd listened patiently to my dreams of opening a café-bakery someday. I ran my fingers over the spines of his books, pausing at the collection of journals on the bottom shelf. I'd never read them. They'd seemed too private, too personal. But now, seeking guidance, I pulled one out and opened it to a random page. October 15th, 1983. Made an offer on the Riverside property today. The numbers are tight, but my instinct says it's right. Helen thinks I'm crazy to take on more debt when the economy is so uncertain. Maybe I am, but sometimes the best opportunities come disguised as impossible challenges. I smiled, hearing his voice in the written words. This was exactly how he'd spoken, thoughtful, plain-spoken wisdom. I turned to another entry, this one from more recent years. April 3rd, 2018. Rebecca visited today. So bright, so capable. She has all the technical knowledge I never had at her age, but she's impatient, always looking for the shortcut, the quick win. Doesn't understand yet that the relationships are what sustain you when the market turns, when the numbers fail. How do I teach her what took me decades to learn? My breath caught. He'd been thinking about these same issues, these same dynamics. Years before his death, I flipped forward several months. August 17, 2018. Emma came by with fresh scones. We talked about the new cafe opening downtown. Her eyes lit up, describing their artisan approach, their community focus. She understands intuitively what makes a business more than just a profit center. But she lacks confidence, doesn't see her own potential, always underestimates herself. So different from Rebecca in that way. I sat back in his chair, processing what I was reading. He'd seen us so clearly, our strengths, our weaknesses, our complementary qualities. I turned to an entry from just 6 months before his death. January 12th, 2022. Met with Morrison today about the trust structure. He thinks I'm making a mistake, that it will cause conflict between the girls. Perhaps he's right in the short term. But I'm thinking about the long view. They need each other more than they realize. Emma's heart and Rebecca's head, together they could build something remarkable. Apart, they'll always be incomplete. The question is whether they'll figure that out before they tear each other apart. Tears blurred my vision. He had known exactly what he was doing. The trust, the conditions, the apparent favoritism. It wasn't about choosing one of us over the other. It was about creating a situation that would force us to recognize what we could be together. I closed the journal, a sense of clarity washing over me. The decision about Rebecca's proposal wasn't just about business structure or asset management. It was about whether I was willing to take the leap of faith Grandpa had been preparing us for. The next morning, I called Rebecca. "Can you meet me at Grandpa's house? There's something I want to show you." An hour later, we sat side by side in his study, the journal open between us. I watched her face as she read entry after entry, observations about her determination, her intelligence, her occasional blindness to the human element in business, about my empathy, my work ethic, my lack of confidence in my own abilities. When she finished reading, she looked up, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "He saw us," she said softly. "Really saw us. All of us, the good and the bad." "He did," I agreed. "And he believed in both of us. Together." "So my counter-proposal," she began, "was exactly what he was hoping for," I finished. "A true partnership that combines our different strengths." She nodded slowly, processing this revelation. "I always thought he favored you," she admitted. "That he saw you as better somehow." "And I always thought he respected you more," I countered. that your success made my choices seem small in comparison. We sat in silence for a moment, the grandfather clock ticking steadily in the hall, marking the passage of time and change. "So what now?" Rebecca asked finally. I took a deep breath. Now we honor what he really wanted to give us. Not just assets to manage, but a way back to each other. A chance to build something together that's greater than what either of us could create alone. "You're accepting my counterproposal?" she clarified. "With a few minor adjustments we can discuss," I nodded. "But yes, the core idea, true partnership with complementary roles, that's what I want too." The smile that broke across her face was unlike any I'd seen from her in years. Open, genuine, without the defensive edge that had become her default. For a moment, I glimpsed the sister I'd been close to as a child, before competition and comparison drove us apart. "I think this calls for a drink," she said, standing. Grandpa kept a bottle of Macallan in the cabinet for special occasions. "At 10 in the morning?" I laughed. "It's a special occasion," she insisted, finding the bottle and 2 crystal tumblers. She poured a small amount in each, handing one to me. "To Grandpa Henry," she said, raising her glass. "The cleverest, most manipulative old man either of us will ever know." I smiled, raising my own glass. "And to us, partners at last." The weeks that followed were transformative. We formalized our agreement with Mr. Morrison's help, creating a management structure that respected my position as trustee, while establishing Rebecca's authority in her areas of expertise. The advisory board expanded to include her, and we began meeting regularly to strategize about the trust's future. The family was astonished by our sudden cooperation. Mom kept asking what had happened, unable to believe the dramatic shift in our relationship. Uncle Steve seemed relieved that the legal drama had ended, while Cousin Nathan joked that we should have recorded the whole saga for a reality TV show. But the most profound change wasn't in the legal documents or management structure. It was in how Rebecca and I related to each other. The competitiveness that had defined our relationship for years began to ease, replaced by genuine collaboration. We still disagreed, often vigorously, but the disagreements became productive rather than destructive. One evening, about 6 months after the will reading, Rebecca and I stood at the Parkview Apartments construction site. The foundation issues had been resolved, and the framework was beginning to take shape. Workers moved efficiently across the site, transforming blueprints into reality. "It's going to be beautiful," I observed, looking at the plans spread out on the hood of Rebecca's car. 50 affordable units for seniors, community spaces, gardens, and financially sustainable, Rebecca added. "The tax incentives and city grants offset the lower rental income. The trust actually comes out ahead compared to market rate development when you factor in the long-term stability." I glanced at her, smiling. That's the kind of analysis I never would have thought to do. And the community impact, the focus on dignity for seniors, that's the kind of value I wouldn't have prioritized, she acknowledged, at least not before. We stood in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the construction site in golden light. "I've been thinking about Grandpa's house," Rebecca said suddenly. "What if, instead of selling it, we turned it into the headquarters for the trust? Convert the study into a proper office, use the living room for meetings. It feels right somehow." The suggestion touched me deeply. "I'd like that," I said. "It would keep his presence in what we're building." "And maybe," she continued, a hint of mischief in her voice, "we could convert the guest house into a test kitchen for that café-bakery concept you've been dreaming about." I stared at her, surprised. "You'd want to include that in the trust's portfolio?" "Why not?" she shrugged. "Small, initial investment, potential for growth, clear community benefit. It fits our balanced approach. And besides," she added with a small smile, "you've supported my vision. It's time I supported yours." In that moment, standing amid the beginnings of what would become housing for seniors who needed it, discussing a future that would honor both our dreams, I finally understood the full measure of Grandpa Henry's gift to us. It had never been about the money, the properties, the business holdings. Those were just tools, means to an end. What he'd really given us was the chance to see beyond our differences, to recognize how much stronger we were together than apart. To rebuild not just his legacy, but our bond as sisters. As we walked back to our cars, Rebecca paused. You know what's funny? If you had received a conventional inheritance in the will that day, if Grandpa had just split everything equally, between us, we'd probably still be rivals. Probably, I agreed. I'd be trying to prove I deserved it. You'd be trying to prove you could do more with it. Instead, we're here. She gestured to the construction site, to the plans we'd made, together, to the new reality we were creating. He was smarter than both of us, I said, smiling. Much smarter, she agreed. But together, we might eventually catch up. 6 months after the will reading, the words my sister had smirked still echoed occasionally in my mind. You get nothing. From Grandpa's will. She had been wrong, of course. I had received everything that really mattered. A purpose, a challenge, a pathway back to the sister I had lost, and the wisdom to see that true wealth isn't measured in assets, but in connections. And that second document, the one the Executor had pulled out just when all seemed lost, had changed not just our inheritances, but ourselves. Changed us in ways money alone never could. Changed us for the better. Which, I was beginning to understand, had been Grandpa Henry's plan all along. The grand opening of Parkview Apartments coincided with the first anniversary of Grandpa Henry's death. It seemed fitting somehow, as if the universe had aligned to remind us exactly what we were celebrating. Not just a building completion, but the continuation of a legacy. Rebecca and I stood side by side on the small stage that had been set up in the courtyard, watching as elderly residents toured their new homes for the first time. Some moved slowly with walkers or canes, others were accompanied by adult children or grandchildren, but all wore expressions of wonder and gratitude as they explored spaces designed specifically for their needs and dignity. Mrs. Abernathy is crying, Rebecca whispered, nodding toward an elegant woman in her 80s who stood on a second-floor balcony, handkerchief pressed to her eyes. Happy tears, I think, I replied. She told me earlier she's been living with her daughter's family for the past 3 years. This is her first place of her own since her husband died. Rebecca nodded, understanding. Independence with support. That's what Grandpa believed everyone deserved. The phrase caught me by surprise, not because it was wrong, but because it was so perfectly right. It captured the essence of Grandpa Henry's philosophy, both in business and in how he'd raised us. Support without control, guidance without dictation, resources paired with responsibility. That should be on our mission statement, I said impulsively. Our what? Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Our mission statement, I repeated. For the Matthews Legacy Trust, we have policies and procedures and financial goals, but we've never articulated why we're doing this. What values guide our decisions? A slow smile spread across her face. Independence with support, she mused. Building foundations for others to grow. Creating spaces for dignity and possibility. Exactly. I nodded eagerly. The financial returns matter, but they're not the whole story. They never were for Grandpa. No, she agreed softly. They weren't. As the ceremony began, with the mayor cutting a ribbon and offering predictable platitudes about community investment, I found myself studying my sister's profile. The rigid competitiveness that had defined her for so long had softened, replaced by something more grounded, more authentic. She still wore designer clothes and maintained her polished appearance, but the desperate edge was gone. the need to constantly prove her worth through status and achievement. The change in me was perhaps even more dramatic. The timid barista, who had once been paralyzed by the responsibility thrust upon her, now spoke confidently with business leaders and community organizers. I still worked at the cafe 3 days a week, partly to honor Grandpa's conditions, partly because I genuinely enjoyed the connection to everyday people and simple pleasures, but I no longer defined myself by my limitations. Together, we had become something neither of us could have been alone. The past year had transformed not just our relationship, but our individual identities, reshaping us into the women Grandpa Henry had somehow seen beneath our facades all along. After the ceremony, as residents and their families enjoyed refreshments, in the community room, Rebecca pulled me aside. "We need to talk," she said, her expression serious but not stern. "About the 5-year conditions." My stomach tightened. The 5 years of restrictions Grandpa had placed on me, maintaining my modest lifestyle, keeping my cafe job, limiting major purchases, were a frequent source of tension between us. Rebecca thought they were unnecessarily restrictive now, that I'd proven my capability as trustee. I saw them as important protection against the corrupting influence of sudden wealth. "What about them?" I asked cautiously. "They're almost halfway over," she said. "Have you thought about what comes next? What you want your life to look like when you're no longer bound by those limitations?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on honoring the conditions that I'd barely considered the freedom that would eventually follow. "Not really," I admitted. "It seems so far away still." Rebecca shook her head. "That's exactly the problem. You're so used to delaying your own dreams that you're not planning for them. That's not what Grandpa wanted." "How do you know what he wanted?" I challenged, more sharply than I intended. She didn't take the bait. "Because I've read every entry in his journals now, just like you have. He didn't want to trap you in permanent limitation. He wanted to give you time to develop judgment, perspective, priorities, before having unlimited resources at your disposal." I knew she was right, but the thought of planning for wealth felt uncomfortable, almost disloyal to the person I'd been. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked. "That we start envisioning the next chapter, not just for the trust, but for you personally." She gestured around us at the Parkview apartments. "We're good at planning for others' futures. We should apply the same care to yours." Before I could respond, Mr. Morrison approached, smiling broadly. "Ladies, the mayor would like a photo with both of you for the city newsletter." The conversation was shelved temporarily, but Rebecca's words lingered in my mind throughout the rest of the event. What did I want my life to look like when the 5 years ended? The question felt both liberating and terrifying. Later that evening, after the last residents had settled into their new homes and the catering staff had cleared away the remains of the celebration, Rebecca and I sat alone in the apartment we'd set aside as an on-site manager's office. Through the window, twilight settled over the courtyard garden where several elderly residents still lingered, getting to know one another over the raised flower beds we'd insisted on including in the design. "This is what success looks like," Rebecca said quietly, following my gaze. "Not just the financial metrics or the construction timeline, but this. People finding community, dignity, purpose." "Grandpa would have loved seeing this," I agreed. "He does see it," she replied with unexpected conviction. "Through us. Through what we've built together." The sentiment moved me in a way I hadn't anticipated. For all her corporate polish and financial acumen, Rebecca had depths of emotion she rarely revealed. "About what you said earlier," I began, hesitantly. "About planning for when the conditions end." "Yes?" she prompted. "I do have dreams," I admitted. "Things I've barely let myself think about because they seemed impossible for so long." "Tell me," she said simply. And so I did. About the café-bakery concept I'd been developing for years. a place that would combine my culinary training with spaces for community connection. About the cooking program I wanted to create for underserved youth. About traveling to learn baking traditions from around the world. Rebecca listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just letting me articulate desires. I'd kept contained for so long. When I finally ran out of words, slightly embarrassed by my enthusiasm, she pulled a small notebook from her bag and began writing. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Making notes," she replied matter-of-factly. "This is the beginning of your personal strategic plan. Dreams are wonderful, Emma, but plans make them happen." I laughed. "You would turn my dream cafe into a strategic initiative." "Of course I would," she agreed unapologetically. "That's what I'm good at. You create the vision, I create the roadmap. That's how we work." The simple confidence in her statement, "That's how we work," struck me. A year ago, we could barely be in the same room without tension. Now we had a rhythm, a partnership that acknowledged our differences as strengths rather than sources of conflict. "Okay, strategic planning director," I teased. "What's the first step in this grand roadmap?" "Finding the right location," she answered immediately. "Not just any storefront, but one with the specific qualities your concept needs. The right neighborhood demographic, proper zoning for both retail and educational use, adequate space for your vision to grow. That could take months," I pointed out. "Exactly," she nodded. "Which is why we start now, while you're still under the conditions. So when the 5 years are up, you're ready to move immediately on the opportunity you've carefully selected." It made perfect sense, of course. This was why Rebecca excelled in finance and business strategy. She thought in systems, in sequential steps, in preparation meeting opportunity. "Thank you," I said sincerely, "for helping me think bigger." She smiled, a hint of her old competitiveness flashing through. "Someone has to. You'd be content with a kitchen the size of a closet and 5 tables if it meant you could start sooner?" "I would not," I protested, then conceded, "Okay, maybe I would. But that's because I care more about getting started than having everything." "Perfect." "And that's why we need each other," she said simply. "Your drive to begin and my insistence on proper foundations. Together, we might actually get it right." As we locked up the office and walked to our cars, the newly installed lights in the courtyard garden illuminated the path. Several residents were still outside, having brought chairs to enjoy the mild evening. "Ms. Matthews!" one called out. "Mrs. Abernathy," the woman who had been moved to tears earlier. "Won't you join us for a moment?" Rebecca glanced at her watch, a subtle gesture I'd come to recognize as her calculating whether a social interaction was worth the time investment. To my surprise, she nodded. "We'd be delighted," she called back, steering me toward the small gathering. The elderly residents had formed a circle around one of the garden beds, where someone had uncorked a bottle of champagne, clearly not part of the official refreshments. "We're having our own little housewarming," Mrs. Abernathy explained, with a mischievous smile. "Care for a glass?" I accepted gratefully, but Rebecca hesitated. "Just a small one," she said. "I'm driving back to the city tonight." "Nonsense," declared a gentleman with a magnificent white mustache. "You young ladies built us homes. Least we can do is insist you celebrate properly." "Mr. Fitzgerald is right," Mrs. Abernathy agreed. "Your grandfather would have joined us without a second thought." The mention of Grandpa Henry startled us both. "You knew our grandfather?" I asked. "Of course, dear," she nodded. "Henry and I served on the library board together for 15 years. He talked about both of you constantly." "He did?" Rebecca's voice held uncharacteristic vulnerability. "Oh my, yes," Mrs. Abernathy said, accepting a refill from Mr. Fitzgerald. "So proud of his granddaughters. Rebecca with her financial brilliance, Emma with her big heart and talent for bringing people together. He always said if you two ever joined forces, you'd be unstoppable." I felt tears prick behind my eyes. and beside me, Rebecca went very still. This was confirmation from an unexpected source, evidence that Grandpa's plan for us hadn't been a last-minute decision, but a long-held hope. "To Henry," Mr. Fitzgerald proposed, raising his glass. Who knew exactly what he was doing? "To Henry," the small circle echoed. As we sipped champagne in the garden with our grandfather's friends, listening to stories about him we'd never heard before, I felt a sense of completion I hadn't expected. The Parkview apartments weren't just a building project or a financial investment. They were a gathering place for people who had known and valued Grandpa Henry, who kept his memory alive in ways a sterile trust document never could. Rebecca must have felt it too, because she abandoned her plan to drive back to the city that night. Instead, we stayed for hours, collecting stories and memories, laughing until our sides ached at tales of Grandpa's stubbornness and generosity. It was nearly midnight when we finally said our goodbyes, promising to visit again soon. As we walked to our cars, Rebecca linked her arm through mine, a gesture of casual affection she hadn't offered since we were children. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the mission statement you mentioned earlier." "And?" I prompted. "I think we need to include something about connections," she said thoughtfully. "Not just physical spaces or financial support, but fostering relationships that outlast us. Like what we just experienced back there." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. "The intangible assets," I suggested. "The ones that don't show up on balance sheets, but matter more in the end." "Exactly," she agreed. "That's what Grandpa built that was truly valuable. Connections, trust, memories, impact. And that's what we're continuing," I added. The next morning, I woke early in my still modest apartment, mind buzzing with ideas sparked by the previous day's events. Rebecca had left with promises to start researching potential locations for my future cafe, and I'd agreed to draft the mission statement that would articulate the values guiding the Matthews Legacy Trust. As I made coffee, my phone buzzed with an unexpected text from Mr. Morrison. "Need to see both you and Rebecca. Important matter regarding the trust. My office, 10 a.m.? I frowned, checking the time. It was barely 7:30, unusually early for our typically formal lawyer to send messages. I texted Rebecca, who was equally puzzled but agreed to meet me at his office. The walk to Morrison and Associates brought back vivid memories of the will reading a year earlier. The tension, the shock, Rebecca's cruel smirk when she thought I'd been left nothing. How far we'd come since that day. How much had changed between us? Mr. Morrison greeted us in the lobby himself rather than having his assistant show us in. Another unusual sign that heightened my concern. "Is everything okay?" I asked as he ushered us into his office. "Nothing's wrong," he assured us, "but something has come to my attention that requires immediate discussion." On his desk lay a thick manila envelope, sealed with wax in an old-fashioned manner I recognized immediately. Grandpa Henry's preferred method for important documents. "This was in our firm's vault," Mr. Morrison explained, "with explicit instructions to present it to both of you 1 year after the trust was established, assuming certain conditions were met." "What conditions?" Rebecca asked, her business instincts immediately engaged. "That the two of you were working together in some capacity," he replied. "Cooperating rather than competing." We exchanged glances. "We definitely meet that condition," I confirmed. "So I've observed," he smiled slightly, "which is why I'm authorized to give you this now. It's from your grandfather." He pushed the envelope across the desk toward us. Neither of us moved to take it immediately, both momentarily frozen by the realization that Grandpa Henry had planned even further ahead than we'd realized, that he'd anticipated this moment, this reconciliation. "Should we open it here?" I asked uncertainly. "That's entirely up to you," Mr. Morrison replied. "The contents are for your eyes only. I have no knowledge of what's inside." Rebecca finally reached for the envelope, her normally steady hands trembling slightly. We'll open it together, she decided, but perhaps somewhere more private? Mr. Morrison nodded understandingly. Take all the time you need. We left his office with the envelope tucked securely in Rebecca's leather portfolio. By unspoken agreement, we walked to a small park nearby, finding a secluded bench beneath a spreading oak tree. You should do the honors, Rebecca said, handing me the envelope. You were always closer to him. We both were, I corrected gently. Just in different ways. I broke the wax seal carefully and opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter and several legal documents. Read it aloud, Rebecca requested, her voice uncharacteristically soft. I nodded, unfolding the letter written in Grandpa Henry's distinctive penmanship. My dear girls, I began, already feeling a lump forming in my throat. If you're reading this, a year has passed since my departure, and something remarkable has happened. You've found your way to each other. You've begun to understand what I've known all along, that separately, you are exceptional, but together, you are extraordinary. The past year has likely been challenging. Rebecca, you've had to confront the limits of ambition without purpose. Emma, you've had to overcome the constraints of purpose without confidence. Both difficult lessons, both necessary. By now, the trust is flourishing under your combined care. Emma's intuitive understanding of human needs balanced by Rebecca's strategic brilliance, exactly as I envisioned. What you hold in your hands is the final piece of my plan for you both. The legal documents enclosed modify the trust in one significant way. They officially name Rebecca as co-trustee, with equal legal authority and responsibility, effective immediately. Now, Emma, before you worry that I'm contradicting my earlier decision, listen carefully. This was always the intended outcome, but it could not be granted. It had to be earned. Not by Rebecca proving her expertise, which was never in doubt, but by both of you proving you could transcend the competition that has defined your relationship for too long. Rebecca, your position comes with one condition that mirrors what I required of Emma. For the remainder of the original 5-year period, you must spend time each week directly serving those the trust benefits. Not managing from a distance, but engaging personally with the people whose lives are touched by our work. Emma will guide you in this, just as you have guided her in business matters. Now, about the café-bakery Emma has dreamed of for so long. The documents include provision for a separate allocation of funds, available immediately and exempt from the 5-year restrictions, specifically for this purpose. It is to be a joint venture between you, Emma providing the culinary vision, Rebecca the business structure, a laboratory for your partnership, if you will. My darlings, what I leave you is not just material wealth, but the greatest lesson I learned in my long life. That true success is measured not in dollars, but in human connection, not in individual achievement, but in what we build together. With all my love, your grandfather, Henry. I lowered the letter, my vision blurred with tears. Beside me, Rebecca sat very still, her own eyes glistening. Co-trustees, she whispered finally. Equal partners. It's what I wanted, but wouldn't let myself hope for. And the cafe, I added, equally stunned. Not in some distant future, but now. Together. We sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the magnitude of what had just happened. Grandpa Henry had orchestrated one final surprise, one last lesson, in his ongoing education of his granddaughters. He really did know us better than we knew ourselves, Rebecca said eventually. He knew I needed to learn humility before I could lead effectively. And he knew you needed to prove your capability to yourself before you could accept me as an equal partner. The question is, I said, turning to face her, are we ready for this next step? Are you prepared for the condition he set? Direct? Service? Personal engagement with the people we help? She considered this seriously. It won't come naturally to me, she admitted. I'm more comfortable with spreadsheets than with people's personal struggles. But yes, I'm ready to learn. From you, from them, from the experience itself. And I'm ready to let go of my fears about money changing me, I added. To embrace the opportunity to build something that combines all of who I am, not just the cafe worker or the trust manager, but both. Rebecca straightened, her business, mind already engaging with the new possibilities. We should review these documents thoroughly before making any announcements. And we'll need to update all the trust paperwork to reflect my new role. I laughed. That's exactly what Grandpa meant about our complementary approaches. I'm sitting here thinking about what color to paint the cafe walls, and you're thinking about legal documentation. She smiled, acknowledging the truth in my observation. We need both perspectives, the vision and the structure, the heart and the head. Independence with support, I quoted our emerging mission statement. For others and for ourselves. As we gathered the documents and prepared to return to Mr. Morrison's office to begin the legal process of implementing Grandpa Henry's final instructions, I felt a profound sense of rightness. The journey that had begun a year ago with Rebecca's smug smirk and the shocking words, "You get nothing from Grandpa's will," had led us to a destination neither of us could have anticipated. We had received the true inheritance, not just assets to manage or enterprises to build, but a restored relationship, a partnership forged through challenge and growth. The second document the Executor had pulled out that day had been just the beginning of Grandpa's plan. This final letter was its completion, the closing of one circle and the opening of another. As we walked back to the law office, arm in arm, I thought about how deceptive appearances can be. To anyone passing by, we were just two women on a spring morning, perhaps friends or colleagues heading to a meeting. They couldn't see the invisible bonds that connected us, to each other, to the grandfather whose wisdom continued to guide us, to the legacy we were now truly sharing. "What should we call it?" Rebecca asked suddenly. "Call what?" "The cafe," she clarified. "Your cafe. Our cafe." I considered for a moment, then smiled. "Henry's place," I said with certainty. A place for food, community, and connection. Everything he valued most. "Henry's place," she repeated, nodding approval. "Perfect." And so, on a bright spring morning, exactly 1 year after a will reading that had seemed to divide us forever, Rebecca and I took the first steps toward a future our grandfather had carefully, lovingly planned. A future in which we would build together what neither of us could have created alone. The person who truly gets nothing is the one who fails to recognize that the most valuable inheritances can't be measured in dollars or listed in legal documents. They're measured in wisdom shared, in lessons learned, in relationships restored, and in the legacy we choose to create with what we've been given. Grandpa Henry had known that all along, and now, finally, so did we. The morning of my 30th birthday dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the windows of my new apartment above Henry's place. I'd moved in just 2 weeks earlier, after the extensive renovations were finally complete. The space was still half unpacked, cardboard boxes stacked in corners, but it already felt more like home than anywhere I'd lived since childhood. From my bedroom window, I could see early morning pedestrians pausing to peer into the cafe windows below, curious about the new establishment on their street. The grand opening was still a week away, but word had been spreading through the neighborhood. Yesterday, an elderly couple had knocked on the door while Rebecca and I were testing equipment, asking when they could come for breakfast. Their eagerness had made both of us smile. My phone chimed with birthday wishes, first from Mom and Dad in Maine, then a flurry from friends and former coworkers at the cafe where I'd continued working part-time until just a month ago. Tanya, my old manager, had thrown me a tearful going-away party, making me promise to hire her if Henry's place ever expanded to a second location. The most recent text was from Rebecca. "Happy 30th. Meet me downstairs in 30 minutes. bringing supplies for test-run breakfast service. I smiled at her efficiency, turning even my birthday into a practical opportunity to fine-tune our operations before the official opening. That was Rebecca, always strategic, always planning. But the past 18 months had softened her edges enough that I knew there would be something special hidden within the practicality. After a quick shower, I dressed in the chef's whites Rebecca had insisted on ordering for the whole kitchen staff. Presentation matters, Emma. And made my way downstairs, unlocking the connecting door that led directly from my apartment to the cafe's back hallway. The fragrance hit me immediately, the mingled aromas of fresh coffee, baking bread, and something sweeter. Following my nose to the kitchen, I found Rebecca already there, dressed impeccably as always, but with an apron protecting her designer outfit. On the center island sat a spectacular birthday cake, 3 layers of what appeared to be my grandmother's famous lemon blueberry recipe, decorated with fresh flowers and berries. "You baked," I said, genuinely astonished. Rebecca's talents were many, but culinary skill had never been among them. "I had help," she admitted with a small smile. "Mrs. Abernathy supervised. Apparently she was quite the baker in her day." The thought of my elegant, serious sister taking baking instructions from the spirited octogenarian we'd met at Parkview Apartments made me laugh out loud. I would have paid good money to witness that collaboration. It was educational, Rebecca allowed, a hint of humor in her voice. Though I maintain that baking would be more efficient with more precise measurements than a good pinch and until it looks right. "That's why you're the business mind and I'm the chef," I reminded her, examining the cake with genuine appreciation. "This is beautiful, Becca. Thank you." She straightened, pleased by the compliment. "Happy birthday, Em. But don't thank me yet. You haven't tasted it." "I'm sure it's perfect. It better be. I made it 3 times before Mrs. Abernathy deemed it acceptable." The mental image of my perfectionist sister redoing a cake until it met an elderly woman's exacting standards made my heart swell with unexpected emotion. This was so far from where we'd been 2 years ago, from the brittle, competitive siblings who could barely speak without sniping at each other. "Now," Rebecca continued briskly, checking her watch, "we have 45 minutes before the contractors arrive for the final inspection. Just enough time for breakfast and cake." She gestured to the cafe's front section, where I now noticed a table set for 2 by the window, complete with fresh flowers and a small stack of wrapped presents. "You thought of everything," I said, following her into the dining area. "I tried," she replied simply. Over breakfast, a delicious spread of pastries from a nearby bakery we'd befriended, Rebecca unveiled her birthday gifts: a set of custom chef's knives with my name engraved on the blades, a rare cookbook from a famous Parisian patisserie, and a framed black and white photograph of Grandpa Henry standing proudly in front of his first business property. "Where did you find this?" I asked, running my fingers over the frame. "In one of the boxes at his house," she explained. "I've been going through them on weekends, organizing his personal effects. There's a whole album of photographs from his early business days. I thought this one belonged here, in our first joint venture." The thoughtfulness of the gesture moved me deeply. Rebecca had once been so focused on her own ambitions that she rarely noticed others' emotional needs. Now she was attuned not just to my practical requirements, but to the sentimental connections that gave those practical matters meaning. "It's perfect," I said softly. "He should be here with us." "He is," she replied with uncharacteristic gentleness. "In every decision we make, every value we uphold." We were interrupted by a knock at the cafe's front door, the contractors arriving for the final inspection before our health department review. Rebecca immediately shifted into business mode, producing a clipboard with a detailed checklist of items to verify. I watched her interact with the contractors, admiring the way she commanded respect without being domineering, the way she asked detailed questions without micromanaging. She had always been competent, But now her competence was tempered with a human touch that made people want to work with her rather than simply for her. As the inspection proceeded, I turned my attention to the kitchen, using the quiet morning to finalize our opening week menu. We'd decided on a soft launch approach, a limited menu executed perfectly rather than an ambitious array of options that might overwhelm our new staff. The focus would be on quality breakfast and lunch items, locally sourced whenever possible, with a rotating selection of special baked goods that could eventually become our signature offerings. By mid-morning, the contractors had completed their review, giving us a clean bill of health with only minor adjustments needed before the health department visit. Rebecca was visibly pleased, checking off items on her project timeline with evident satisfaction. "We're ahead of schedule," she announced, joining me in the kitchen. "If the health inspection goes well tomorrow, we could potentially move the opening up by a few days." "Let's stick to the original plan," I suggested. "Give ourselves a buffer for unexpected issues and use the extra time for more staff training." She nodded, acknowledging the wisdom in the more conservative approach. "You're right. Better to open perfectly on schedule than rush and risk problems." This, too, was a change, Rebecca accepting an adjustment to her plans without resistance, recognizing that my more cautious approach had merit. The partnership Grandpa Henry had envisioned for us had materialized in ways even he might not have expected, each of us influencing the other toward a more balanced perspective. We spent the rest of the day in final preparations, confirming deliveries with suppliers, reviewing procedures with our small but enthusiastic staff, putting finishing touches on the decor. By evening, exhausted but satisfied, we locked up the cafe and headed to the small courtyard garden we'd created behind the building. The garden had been my idea, a peaceful retreat for staff breaks and eventually, once established, a source of fresh herbs and edible flowers for the kitchen. Rebecca had initially questioned the expense and space allocation, but ultimately embraced the concept, even bringing in a landscape designer to maximize the small area's potential. Now, as twilight descended, we sat on the bench we'd positioned, beneath an ornamental cherry tree, sharing a bottle of wine and the remains of the birthday cake. 30, I mused, swirling the wine in my glass. Not where I expected to be at this age. "No?" Rebecca prompted. "I thought I'd still be saving. Tips for culinary school, maybe working as a line cook somewhere if I was lucky." I gestured toward the cafe building. "This was the dream for 40, not 30. "And yet you're ready for it," she observed. "More than ready." I considered this. "I think I am. But not because of the money or the opportunity. Because of everything else these past 2 years have taught me. About business, yes, but more importantly about myself. About what I'm capable of." "That was his gift," Rebecca said quietly. "Not the trust, not the properties or investments. The challenge that forced you to recognize your own strength." "And yours?" I asked. She was silent for a moment, gazing at the small garden beds we'd just planted with late summer herbs. "Perspective," she said finally. "I had achievements, credentials, professional respect. What I didn't have was meaning, purpose beyond. The next promotion, the next deal, the next validation." Her honesty struck me. 2 years ago, Rebecca would never have admitted to such vulnerability, to any lack in her carefully curated life. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Grandpa had just split everything equally between us?" I asked. "If there had been no conditions, no second document, no dramatic reveal?" She laughed softly. "We'd have torn each other apart within a year. I'd have dismissed your input as naive and impractical. You'd have resented my controlling approach. We'd have ended up in court, spending ridiculous amounts on lawyers instead of building something worthwhile." "And personally?" I pressed. "Would we have found our way back to being sisters?" Rebecca's expression grew serious. "I don't think so," she admitted. "We were too far gone, too entrenched in our separate worlds and separate values. We needed something dramatic to break. The pattern." She was right, of course. The shock of that day in the lawyer's office, my apparent disinheritance followed by the unexpected responsibility of the trust, had been the earthquake that changed the landscape between us. Without it, we would likely have continued our slow drift apart, connected by DNA but little else. "I'm glad he did it this way," I said finally, even though it was manipulative, even though it caused pain at first. "That's the difference between price and value," Rebecca observed. "Sometimes the most valuable things come at the highest price." It was such a Grandpa Henry thing to say that we both smiled, recognizing his influence in her words. "To Grandpa," I proposed, raising my glass. "Master strategist and meddling grandfather." "To Grandpa," she echoed. Who knew exactly what he was doing? As darkness settled over our little garden, fireflies began to appear, their gentle light blinking among the newly planted herbs. Neither of us moved to go inside, content in the peaceful moment and each other's company. "There is one more birthday surprise," Rebecca said eventually, "but it's not here. We need to go to Grandpa's house tomorrow morning." "The house?" I asked, surprised. We'd kept the property as a headquarters for the trust operations, converting most of it to functional office space while preserving his study exactly as he'd left it. "What's there?" "Something I found while organizing his personal effects," she replied mysteriously. "Something I think you should see on your birthday specifically." My curiosity was piqued, but I knew better than to press for details. When Rebecca planned a surprise, she guarded it carefully until the proper moment. "All right," I agreed. "What time?" 9 should work. We can go after the health inspector's visit." The next morning brought both nervousness and excitement. The health inspection was the final hurdle before our opening, the last official approval we needed to launch Henry's place. Rebecca arrived early, clipboard in hand, every required document organized in a labeled folder. The inspector, a stern woman in her 50s with a reputation for thoroughness, spent 2 hours examining every corner of our operation, from the temperature of the refrigerators to the placement of hand-washing stations. Rebecca shadowed her the entire time, answering questions with calm precision, while I focused on demonstrating proper food handling procedures in the kitchen. When the woman finally signed off on the inspection form with a grudging, "Excellent preparation, ladies," Rebecca and I exchanged subtle high fives behind her back. "One more box checked," Rebecca said as we watched the inspector drive away. "Now for your birthday mystery." The drive to Grandpa Henry's house took us through familiar neighborhoods, past the cafe where I'd worked for so many years, and finally, into the tree-lined streets of the older established area where our grandfather had lived for most of his adult life. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed fresh landscaping around the property, new flowers in the beds, trimmed hedges, a recently painted front door. "The place looks good," I commented, "better than it has in years." "The trust offices need to reflect our standards," Rebecca explained. "And I thought Grandpa would appreciate us maintaining his home properly, even with its new purpose." Inside, the front rooms had been transformed into efficient but attractive office spaces, with the dining room now serving as a conference area. Beyond these, however, Grandpa's private spaces remained largely untouched: his study, his reading room, his bedroom upstairs. Rebecca led me to the study, where the morning sun streamed through leaded glass windows, illuminating the bookshelves and the massive oak desk where Grandpa had conducted business for decades. "Wait here," she instructed, disappearing into the adjacent storage room that had once been a maid's quarters. She returned moments later carrying a dusty wooden box about the size of a small suitcase. Setting it carefully on the desk, she produced a small key from her pocket. "I found this while cataloging Grandpa's effects," she explained. "It was in his bedroom safe, with a note specifying it should be given to you on your 30th birthday. I've respected his wishes and haven't opened it." My heart quickened. Another message from beyond, another piece of Grandpa Henry's elaborate plan for us. I took the key with slightly trembling fingers and inserted it into the tarnished brass lock. It turned with a satisfying click, and the lid lifted to reveal a treasure trove of memorabilia. On top was an envelope with my name written in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. Beneath it lay an assortment of items: a small leather-bound recipe, book, a collection of vintage cooking utensils, several faded photographs, and at the very bottom, a worn wooden rolling pin tied with a blue ribbon. "What is all this?" I whispered, though I was beginning to understand. "I think the letter will explain," Rebecca suggested gently. I opened the envelope and unfolded several pages of Grandpa's handwriting. "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, you've reached your 30th birthday, and I'm no longer with you in person. But I hope the legacy we've built together, you, your sister, and I, provides some comfort and direction. What you hold in this box is another legacy, one that predates the trust and the business holdings. It belonged to your great-grandmother, Rose, my mother, who was perhaps the finest baker in the county in her day. The leather book contains her recipes, written in her own hand, including the lemon blueberry cake your grandmother later made famous in our family. The utensils were hers as well, simple tools that created extraordinary results in the right hands. And the rolling pin, that was her most treasured possession, given to her by her own mother, who brought it from the old country. 4 generations of our family have used it to create food that nourished bodies and souls alike. I've saved these for you, Emma, because from the time you were small, helping your grandmother in the kitchen with flour-covered hands and determined expression, I recognized in you Rose's special gift, not just for combining ingredients, but for creating experiences, memories, connections through the simple act of feeding others. The trust and the business holdings are important. They provide resources and opportunities to do meaningful work in the world. But never forget that our family's true wealth has always been in the less tangible legacies. The recipes passed down, the skills shared, the values demonstrated through consistent actions. On your 30th birthday, I imagine you standing at a crossroads of sorts. No longer a young adult finding your way, but a woman coming into her full power and purpose. Perhaps by now you've begun to create the cafe you used to describe to me with such passion. Perhaps you and Rebecca have found your way to the partnership I always hoped you would discover. Whatever path you've taken, know that I am proud of you, not for what you've accomplished, but for who you are. For your kindness that never hardened into naivete, your determination that never calcified into stubbornness, your talent that never twisted into arrogance. Use these treasures from our family's past to help create your future. Let great-grandmother Rose's rolling pin continue its journey through capable, caring hands. With all my love, Grandpa Henry. I lowered the letter, tears streaming unchecked, down my face. Rebecca, who had been keeping a respectful distance, moved closer, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. I nodded, unable to speak immediately. Finally, I managed. He knew. Somehow he knew this day would come, that we'd be opening Henry's place, that we'd find our way to working together. Rebecca smiled. He didn't know for certain, but he hoped. And he laid foundations to make it possible. I lifted the rolling pin from the box, running my fingers over the smooth wood worn by decades of use. 4 generations of women in our family had used this simple tool to create nourishment, comfort, celebration. "This belongs in the cafe kitchen," I said with certainty. Not as a decoration, but as a working tool, continuing its purpose. "I think that's exactly what he intended," Rebecca agreed. As we carefully repacked the box to transport its precious contents to Henry's place, I felt a profound sense of connection to our grandfather, to the great-grandmother I'd never met, to the legacy of care and creation that had been passed, down alongside the more tangible assets. "Do you think," I asked hesitantly, "that Grandpa always intended for me to open the cafe?" that all the rest, the trust, the properties, even our partnership, was in service of making that possible. Rebecca considered the question seriously. "Not exactly," she said finally. "I think he saw the cafe as a natural expression of who you are, but the trust and our partnership were about something bigger, about continuing his approach to business as a force for both profit and good. The cafe is part of that, but not the entirety." Her insight struck me as profoundly true. Henry's place wasn't the culmination of Grandpa's plan for us. It was just one manifestation of the values and vision he'd hoped we would embrace together. "We should incorporate some of these recipes into our menu," I suggested, picking up the leather-bound book. "Honor that part of our heritage, too." "Great-grandmother Rose's signature items," Rebecca nodded. "A connection to our past while we build our future. I like it." As we carried the box out to Rebecca's car, the morning sunlight caught the polished brass nameplate we'd recently installed on the front door. Matthew's Legacy Trust, building foundations for dignity and possibility. The phrase made me smile, remembering our conversation at the Parkview, apartments opening, the mission statement we'd crafted together in the months that followed. From that seed of an idea, independence with support, we'd developed a comprehensive vision for how the trust would operate, what values would guide our decisions, what impact we hoped to have on our community. Back at Henry's place, the staff was assembled for a final pre-opening meeting. Our small team included a mix of experienced food service professionals and young people starting their first jobs, the latter part of a youth employment initiative we'd developed in partnership with the local community college. Rebecca led the business portion of the meeting with her usual efficiency, reviewing procedures, schedules, expectations. Then she surprised me by stepping back. "And now," she announced, "Chef Emma will share the culinary vision that brings all these operations to life." Chef Emma. The title still felt new, still carried a weight of both responsibility and achievement. As I described our food philosophy to the attentive staff, emphasizing quality ingredients, careful preparation, and the dining experience we wanted to create, I felt a sudden wave of gratitude for the journey that had led me here. 2 years ago, I'd been a barista with deferred dreams, lacking the confidence and resources to pursue my true passion. Now I stood in my own kitchen, in a business I co-owned, sharing a vision that would soon become reality. After the meeting, as the II staff dispersed to their final preparation tasks, Rebecca pulled me aside. "I have something else for you," she said, producing a small gift bag I hadn't noticed earlier. Inside was a beautiful wooden plaque, clearly custom-made. Engraved on its surface were the words, "Henry's Place founded 2023, Emma and Rebecca Matthews. Proprietors. Food for the body, nourishment for the soul." "For the wall behind the counter," she explained, "so everyone knows this place belongs to both of us." The gesture touched me deeply. Rebecca had never sought public recognition for her role in the cafe, content to handle the business aspects while I served as the public face. This was her way of claiming her place in our shared venture, of acknowledging that Henry's place belonged to both Matthews sisters, just as Grandpa had intended. "It's beautiful," I said sincerely, "and perfect." "One more thing," she added, reaching into her pocket. "I had copies made, one for each of us." She handed me a small photograph, professionally framed. It showed Grandpa Henry in his younger days, standing proudly in front of his first business property. Beside him stood a woman I recognized from family albums as Great-Grandmother Rose, her hand resting on a young Henry's shoulder, both of them smiling with shared pride. "Where did you find this?" I asked, amazed. "It was in one of the albums at the house," Rebecca explained. "I thought it captured where we came from, both sides of our inheritance. The business acumen and the nurturing spirit, Grandpa and Rose, you and me." As we stood in the morning light of our nearly completed cafe, I understood with sudden clarity that the greatest gift Grandpa Henry had given us wasn't the material wealth of the trust, or even the opportunity to build Henry's place. It was the chance to rediscover each other, to forge a partnership that honored both our differences and our shared heritage. The journey that had begun with those devastating words, "You get nothing from Grandpa's will," had led us to a place where nothing had transformed into everything that truly mattered. Purpose, partnership, and the profound satisfaction of continuing a legacy larger than ourselves. In 1 week, Henry's Place would open its doors, welcoming the community into a space created with both head and heart, business sense and nurturing spirit. Great-grandmother Rose's rolling pin would once again shape dough into nourishment. Grandpa Henry's values would once again guide decisions about how resources could best serve people's needs for both physical sustenance and human dignity. And two sisters who had once defined themselves in opposition to each other would stand, side by side, each bringing her unique gifts to their shared purpose, exactly as their grandfather had hoped, exactly as he had planned, from the moment he instructed his lawyer to pull out that second document that changed everything. 5. Years to the day after that fateful will reading, Henry's Place had become a neighborhood institution. The line often stretched out the door on weekend mornings, locals and visitors alike drawn by both our food and the warm atmosphere we'd carefully cultivated. What had begun as a café-bakery had evolved into something more, a community gathering, space where people connected over meals, celebrated milestones, and sometimes just found a moment of peace in their hectic days. I stood in the kitchen doorway, surveying the bustling dining room with quiet satisfaction. Regular customers chatted comfortably with our staff, many of whom had been with us since opening day. The wall behind the counter displayed the wooden plaque Rebecca had given me. Henry's Place, founded 2023, Emma and Rebecca Matthews, proprietors, alongside framed photographs of Grandpa Henry and great-grandmother Rose. Today was special not just because of the anniversary, but because the 5-year conditions Grandpa had placed on me had officially expired. I was now free to live however I chose, to access the Trust's resources without restrictions, to make major life changes if I wished. Yet, surprisingly little would change. The apartment above the cafe remained my home, comfortable and convenient. My lifestyle had gradually evolved to include more conveniences and small luxuries, but never the extravagance Rebecca had once embraced. And while I no longer worked shifts at my old cafe job, I remained hands-on at Henry's Place, still donning chef's whites most days, still creating seasonal menu items, still knowing regular customers by name. The bell above the door chimed, and Rebecca entered, impeccably dressed as always, but with a more relaxed air than she'd had 5 years ago. She spotted me immediately and made her way through the crowded dining room, accepting greetings from regulars with easy familiarity. "Sorry I'm late," she said, joining me at the small table we kept reserved in the corner for business discussions. The meeting with the Parkview Expansion Committee ran long. "Good news?" I asked, pouring her a cup of coffee from the carafe already waiting on the table. She nodded, her expression satisfied. "The funding came through. We can break ground on the additional 30 units next month." The Parkview Apartments expansion had been Rebecca's passion project for the past year, adding more affordable senior housing to the now thriving community complex that had been our first major project together. What had begun as a simple housing development had evolved into a vibrant intergenerational space with community gardens, educational workshops, and regular social events. "That's wonderful," I said sincerely. "Mrs. Abernathy will be thrilled." "She already knows," Rebecca smiled. "I called her from the car. She's forming a welcoming committee for the new residents." Mrs. Abernathy, now approaching 90, had become something of a surrogate grandmother to both of us over the years. Her no-nonsense wisdom and dry humor had helped guide us through business challenges and personal growth alike. The baking lessons she'd given Rebecca had eventually expanded into a monthly cooking class for seniors at Henry's Place, a program that consistently filled to capacity and had been featured in the local newspaper. "So," Rebecca said, her tone shifting to something more serious, "today's the day." I didn't need to ask what she meant. 5 years ago, Grandpa Henry had established conditions that restricted my access to the trust's full resources, requiring me to maintain my modest lifestyle while learning to manage significant wealth. Today, those conditions officially ended. "It is," I agreed, "though it feels less momentous than I expected." "Because you've already been making the transition?" "Gradually," she observed. "As Grandpa intended." She was right. Over the past 5 years, my role in the Matthews Legacy Trust had evolved from reluctant trustee to confident co-leader. Rebecca and I had developed a partnership that leveraged our complementary strengths, her financial acumen and strategic thinking balanced by my people-centered approach and community connections. "I've been thinking about what comes next," I said, sipping my coffee. "For Henry's place, for the trust, for us." "And?" she prompted. "And I think it's time to expand, not just the cafe, but our entire approach to community investment." Rebecca's eyes lit with interest. She pulled out her ever-present notebook, ready to capture ideas. This had become our pattern, me proposing vision, her developing strategy, both of us refining until we reached something better than either could have created alone. "The culinary training program we started last year for at-risk youth," I continued. "It's working even better than we expected. The 6 students who completed it are all employed now, 2 of them here." "True," she agreed. "Miguel's baking skills are exceptional. That sourdough technique he developed has customers raving." "What if we expanded that program? Not just training in our kitchen, but a full culinary institute focusing on sustainable food systems, traditional techniques, entrepreneurial skills. A place where people who might never afford conventional culinary school could develop careers in food service." Rebecca was already writing rapidly, her strategic mind engaging with the concept. "We'd need a larger facility, partnerships with restaurants and food producers for apprenticeships, a scholarship fund. The old warehouse the trust owns on River Street," I suggested. "It has the space, the right zoning, character. Extensive renovations required," she noted, not as an objection, but as a planning consideration. "But yes, the location is perfect, accessible by public transportation near the farmers market." This was how we worked now, building on each other's ideas, neither dominating nor deferring, creating together what neither would have envisioned alone. "We could call it the Rose Institute," I proposed, thinking of our great-grandmother whose rolling pin still occupied a place of honor in Henry's Place kitchen, honoring our family's legacy of nourishment and hospitality. "Perfect," Rebecca nodded, "and fitting for the 5-year mark of our partnership." She closed her notebook and met my eyes directly. "You know, when Grandpa first named you sole, Trustee, I was consumed with resentment. I couldn't understand why he'd choose you. With no business experience, no financial training, over me with my MBA and corporate background." "I remember," I said dryly. "You made your feelings quite clear." She smiled, acknowledging the understatement. "But he was right. Not because you were better suited to manage the trust, but because we both needed to change. You needed to recognize your capability and step into your power. I needed to learn that business success means nothing without purpose and human connection. And together," I added, "we've built something neither of us could have created alone." "Exactly as he planned," Rebecca concluded, the crafty old strategist. We both laughed, picturing Grandpa Henry's satisfied smile at seeing his granddaughters, not just managing his assets, but transforming them into vehicles for meaningful impact. Our conversation was interrupted by Miguel, who approached our table with nervous excitement. Just 19, he'd come to our culinary program from foster care, with no family support but tremendous natural talent. Chef Emma, Ms. Rebecca, he said, using the formal titles he insisted on despite our encouragement to use our first names. I wanted to show you something. He placed a plate between us, displaying an exquisite pastry, layers of delicate dough, seasonal berries, and a subtle glaze that caught the light. It's a new recipe I've been developing, he explained, using the traditional techniques from that book you lent me, but with local ingredients. I examined the creation with genuine admiration. This is beautiful, Miguel. The lamination on the dough is perfect. The presentation is exceptional as well, Rebecca added. Very marketable. His face lit up at our approval. I was thinking it could be a special for the anniversary celebration next week. Absolutely, I agreed. And I think you should lead the preparation, train the other kitchen staff on your technique. His eyes widened. Really? You'd trust me with that? You've earned it, I said simply. As Miguel returned to the kitchen, practically floating, with pride, Rebecca and I exchanged a meaningful glance. This was what success looked like now. Not just profitable businesses or growing assets, but human potential recognized and nurtured. That reminds me, Rebecca said, reaching into her briefcase. I have something for you, for today. She handed me a small wrapped package. Inside was a delicate silver key on a simple chain. What's this for? I asked, turning it over in my hand. The future, she replied cryptically. There's more, but you'll have to come with me to see it. Intrigued, I arranged for the assistant manager to cover my afternoon duties and followed Rebecca to her car. She drove us out of the city, toward the rural countryside where small farms dotted the landscape. After about 30 minutes, she turned onto a winding gravel road that led to a charming farmhouse surrounded by apple orchards. What is this place? I asked as we parked. Currently, it's the Taylor family apple farm, she explained. Third generation. But the children have moved away and aren't interested in farming. The parents are ready to retire. She led me toward the farmhouse, continuing her explanation. It's 20 acres, the orchards, the house, several outbuildings, and that. She pointed to a large barn that had been beautifully restored, its weathered wood gleaming in the afternoon sun. The property came on the market last month. I had our real estate division look into it immediately. Understanding dawned slowly. You bought an apple farm? The trust bought an apple farm, she corrected. Or more specifically, Emma Matthews, private citizen no longer bound by the 5-year restrictions, bought an apple farm, if she wants it. She handed me a folder containing property details, financial projections, and renovation plans. The house needs updating but is structurally sound. The barn was recently converted for events, weddings, family reunions, that sort of thing. The orchards produce several heirloom varieties that aren't widely available commercially. I stared at her, momentarily speechless. You bought me a farm? I secured an option on a farm, she clarified. Whether you exercise that option is entirely your decision, but I hoped, it might be the perfect next chapter. As we walked through the property, Rebecca outlined the vision she'd clearly spent considerable time developing. The orchards continuing to produce under the management of the current foreman who wished to stay on. The barn serving as an event space for farm-to-table dinners and cooking demonstrations. The farmhouse becoming my personal residence, a place of my own beyond the apartment above Henry's place. And this, she said, unlocking the door of a smaller outbuilding with the key identical to the one she'd given me, could be your test kitchen for developing recipes, hosting small classes, writing that cookbook you've been talking about. Inside was a simple open space with high ceilings and large windows that flooded the room with natural light. It needed work, new flooring, updated utilities, proper kitchen equipment. But even empty, it hummed with possibility. The key, I said, understanding now. It's not just symbolic. No, she confirmed. It's yours. Whether you decide to take the property or not, this space is yours to create with as you wish. Your 35th birthday present, 5 years in the making. I turned slowly, taking in the space, imagining what it could become. Not just a professional kitchen, but a sanctuary for creativity, for preservation of traditional techniques, for sharing knowledge. This is overwhelming, I admitted, in the best possible way. Too much? Rebecca asked, a rare note of uncertainty in her voice. No, I assured her. Perfect, like everything you plan, perfect in its timing and execution. Relief softened her expression. You once told me your dream was to have a cafe by 30 and a small farm by 40. We achieved the first ahead of schedule. I thought we might as well be early for the second milestone, too. The thoughtfulness behind the gesture moved me deeply. 5 years ago, Rebecca had been so focused on her own ambitions that she rarely noticed others' dreams. Now she not only remembered my casual mention of a farm someday, but had created a pathway to make it possible. There's no rush to decide, she added. The option is good for 60 days. Take your time, consider whether this is really what you want. But I already knew. Standing in that light-filled space, feeling the peace of the orchard surrounding us, I recognized this place as the next step in the journey Grandpa Henry had set in motion 5 years ago, with those devastating words. You get nothing from Grandpa's will. Nothing had become everything. A thriving business, a healed relationship with my sister, a life rich with purpose and possibility. And now, this new opportunity to grow beyond what I'd imagined for myself. I don't need 60 days, I said. This is it. This is the next chapter. Rebecca smiled, genuine pleasure lighting her face. I hoped you'd say that. As we walked back to the car, she outlined next steps with her usual efficiency: transfer of the property deed, renovation timelines, integration with our existing businesses. The strategic mind that had once intimidated me now provided welcome, structure for my creative vision. There's one more thing, she said as we drove back toward the city. The Taylor family had a condition for the sale. Oh? I asked, suddenly wary. They want the farm's name to remain in some form. It's been in their family for generations. What is it called? Abundance, she replied. Abundance Orchards. The name resonated immediately. Abundance, not just of apples or ingredients, but of opportunity, of connection, of purpose. It captured exactly what Grandpa Henry had ultimately given us through his unorthodox approach to inheritance. Abundance, I repeated. It's perfect. I thought so too, Rebecca agreed. Symbolically appropriate for this new phase of your life, of our work together. As the city skyline came into view, I reflected on the journey of the past 5 years. From that devastating moment in Mr. Morrison's office, through the struggles and breakthroughs that followed, to this moment of expansive possibility, none of it had followed the path I would have chosen or expected. Yet the destination was better than anything I could have planned for myself. Grandpa Henry's apparent cruelty, you get nothing from Grandpa's will, had been the catalyst for everything meaningful I now possessed. The true inheritance had never been the money or properties. It had been the challenge that forced growth, the restrictions that taught discernment, the conflict that forged partnership. It had been the wisdom to recognize that true wealth lies not in what we own, but in what we create, what we share, what we build together. As Rebecca pulled up in front of Henry's place, where the afternoon crowd was beginning to gather for coffee and late lunches, I spotted Mrs. Abernathy seated at her usual window table. She waved, her face lighting up when she saw us both. Ready? To tell her about your farm, Rebecca asked. Our farm, I corrected. Different roles, shared vision. That's how we work, remember? She smiled, acknowledging the truth in my words. Partners in all things, just as Grandpa intended. Just as Grandpa engineered, I amended with a laugh. Together, we walked into the cafe named for the man whose greatest legacy wasn't the material wealth he'd accumulated, but the wisdom with which he'd distributed it. The man who had seen who we could become, separately and together, long before we could see it ourselves. The man who had given me nothing and everything, all with the pull of a second document that changed everything. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.